Hey, what's up, shipbuilders? Hey, so over the past few months, I've been inundated with comments, letters, notes, slates, audio recordings, and full-length novels asking about the gritty details of shipbuilding. Okay, not really inundated, and I do genuinely love the discussions and questions around this game, but one comment in particular sent me down a path I didn't expect, and revealed new facts about this game that caused me to go back and change all of my prior ship builds. It started with what seemed like an innocent question on my video building an extreme ship for extreme difficulty. Why would I choose the Exterminator 95 MeV Auto Helion Beams over the PBO-175 Auto Helion Beams for this build? Further, this fellow shipbuilder referred me to a spreadsheet that documents every weapon in the game, including some hidden stats about weapons such as actual time to reload, as well as the number of shots per magazine for the auto weapon variants. And to their point, it clearly shows the PBO-175 Auto Helion Beams as having a much higher burst damage per second than the Exterminators. But you see, I'm very familiar with this spreadsheet. It has been a foundation of the shipbuilding community since the beginning of Starfield. And kudos to Stalvier, if I'm pronouncing that right, for putting it together along with whoever else I may be missing that contributed to this heroic work. And if I'm getting any of this attribution wrong or incomplete, please correct me in the comments. I'll put a link to this spreadsheet in the description of this video. It must be said that I think this spreadsheet is incredible and the effort required to put it together should be absolutely commended. But having this spreadsheet being used to make a point that the PBO-175s were better due to their burst damage per second gave me significant pause. And that's because I'm also familiar with work done by another shipbuilder who goes by Alan's project. You see, Alan's project did some very interesting tests back near the launch of this game, comparing the PBO-175s to the Exterminators. And what he found was that the two weapons appeared to empty their magazines in nearly the exact same amount of time, but the Exterminators fired 33 shots and the PBOs only 27 shots. Now that's 6 extra shots over the same time period, almost 25% more. So the spreadsheet we were just looking at does appropriately identify the magazine sizes of each of these weapons, but it uses the fire rates presented in the game's UI, which states that the PBO-175s fire 6 times per second and the Exterminators only 5 times per second. This is the primary reason the burst DPS of the PBOs in that spreadsheet is shown as being higher than the Exterminators. But what Alan demonstrated is that the Exterminators fire more shots, 33 compared to 27, in the same amount of time. Now, that very clearly indicates that the fire rate of the Exterminators must be faster than the PBO-175 Auto Helion Beams. So I went back and personally performed the same tests, just to be sure. And what did I find? I found the same results. The Exterminators do fire faster than the PBOs. In the UI, again, the fire rate of the PBOs is listed as 6 shots per second. That would put them up with some of the highest in the game, close to the Vanguard Obliterator autoprojectors. The Exterminator 95 MEV's fire rate is listed as 5, though clearly the PBOs are firing slower than them. So when I slow down the video and count the shots fired over 1 second, the fire rate of the Exterminators turns out to be about 5, and the PBOs is actually about 4. Now, I can also corroborate this by timing how long it takes to deplete a full magazine of ammo, 27 shots for the PBOs, which takes about 7 to 7.5 seconds. That's actually a fire rate of less than 4 shots per second. That's a big difference than the 6 stated in the game's UI. Now, for fairness to the PBOs and possibly my counting per second when I slow down a video, and to be conservative in our analysis, I'm going to be generous and round up and assume the fire rate of the PBO-175 Auto Helion Beams is actually 4, rather than, say, 3.75 or something slightly less than 4. But let's take that figure and go back to the spreadsheet. And instead of looking at rows and columns, I'm going to chart out each weapon's burst damage, its sustained damage, and its range, just to make it a little bit easier to look at. So looking at this chart, it shows every ship weapon in the entire game except for EM weapons because they do EM damage and we're not concerned with that at the moment. Now the horizontal axis is showing burst damage per second. So the farther to the right a weapon is, the higher burst damage it does. and the vertical axis is showing sustained damage per second. So the higher a weapon is on the chart, the more sustained damage it does. And the assumption in this data from the spreadsheet is that you're fully equipping as many of these weapons as you possibly can. So in the case of the Exterminators, we're equipping 3 of them, and the PBOs, we're equipping 4 of them. Also, it assumes that we are fully powering our weapons in order to calculate the reload time. Lastly, the size of each bubble represents each weapon's range. So ideally, we would want weapons that are in the upper right corner of the chart with a large bubble. And how are we handling the difference in damage some weapons do between hull and shields? Well, we're simply taking an average. For particle beams and missiles, they damage both equally, so that's easy. For ballistics and lasers, to appropriately determine their damage potential, we just average these amounts together for purposes of determining the best overall single weapon in the game. I understand in reality we can equip separate weapons, but for this analysis we're out to find the single best weapon and also to distinguish between the PBO-175 Auto Helion Beams and the Exterminator 95 MeV Auto Helion Beams, both of which are particle beams. So averaging their hull and shield damage will lead us to the same answer. Now, there are a lot of bubbles on this chart, which makes it difficult to read. We can clearly see missiles do a lot of burst damage, as a few of them are far to the right of our chart, but they do little sustained damage, which is expected given their slow fire rate and reload times, so they're near the bottom of our chart. To analyze our other weapons, I'm going to zoom this in a little bit, starting out the horizontal axis at 200 DPS, and the vertical axis at 150 sustained DPS. So this will give us a little bit of separation at the top end of the chart, just given the scaling, to see the best weapons in the game. Now, before we update this data for our actual fire rate of the PBO-175s, we see they're displayed as outputting the most burst damage of any particle beam weapon in the game, and the difference in sustained damage between them and the next closest particle beam weapons is pretty minimal. However, let's update the data for what we now know to be their true firing rate. And remember, I think we're being just a little bit generous to them by rounding up to a fire rate of 4. So when we make that update for the actual in-game fire rate of the PBO-175 Auto Helion Beams from 6 to 4, we find that the burst DPS stat drops significantly. In fact, they drop from the number 1 spot amongst all particle beam weapons for burst DPS to 8th place. In 5th place if you exclude turrets. And for sustained DPS, they drop from a close 3rd place all the way down to 7th place amongst particle beams. Now, I do have one additional point to add that actually boosts the Exterminators above the PBOs a bit further, and that's critical hit chance. You see, critical hits deal a ton of damage, and when facing the highest level enemies or playing on extreme difficulty or both, critical hits make a big difference. Plus, when you have fully leveled up your particle beam skill, critical hits happen more often. Well, the way to increase your chances of a critical hit occurring is by firing more often. And the Exterminators fire more shots, nearly 25% more than the PBOs, making their actual damage output over time when considering the critical hit chance that much better than the data in this spreadsheet suggests. So, in summary, I actually have to say thank you to my fellow shipbuilder who spurred me on to undertake this in-depth analysis. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and say that I'm sure you knew where this would lead all along and we're simply offering up an easy topic for my next video, which is much appreciated. But this isn't actually where our analysis ends. You see, I've heard from more than a few of you that have shown love for a different weapon, the Disruptor 3320s, and I found this more than a little surprising because those aren't even an auto variant. It's a standard version, meaning it has to reload after a single shot. It has no magazine of ammo like auto weapons do. See, I generally advocate for fully powering your engines and shield in order to get top performance out of those systems, and spreading your remaining reactor power across weapons, acknowledging you won't have enough reactor power to fully power your weapons, but that's okay because we'll use the auto variants which have a full magazine of ammo, and that magazine can typically decimate any enemy before you need to reload anyway. So why would I be hearing such love for a non-auto weapon? Especially when I look at both the burst DPS and sustained DPS stats for those weapons, including this Disruptor 3320. It's just so much lower than the others. And then the light bulb went off. In the sustained DPS calculation in the spreadsheet we've been looking at, if you break apart the formula into its pieces, it's trying to determine not only the total reload time, but also the time to deplete each weapon's full magazine of ammo. But in my own tests, and in Alan's project's tests, the assumption is that the first shot of each weapon happens immediately, without delay. Therefore, the time it takes to deplete a non-auto weapon's magazine of ammo is instantaneous. It's 0. But this spreadsheet is calculating it as its magazine size, in this case 1, divided by its fire rate. This means the formula for sustained DPS is adding additional non-damage producing time to these non-auto weapons in error. The only amount of time the formula should be considering for non-auto weapons is the time to reload, not the time to deplete its magazine, because the magazine is depleted the very moment it is reloaded. There is no delay. So the formula works for auto weapons that have a magazine, though perhaps you should subtract the first shot, as that is instantaneous for those auto weapons as well, but this is inappropriate for non-auto weapons. Even if we just take a second look to think about this logically, it becomes obvious. For a non-auto weapon, there is no magazine to reload, and therefore when it is fully powered, as is the assumption in this spreadsheet, its burst DPS and its sustained DPS should be exactly the same. But that isn't the case in this spreadsheet, and it's because it falsely assumes a delay in firing that single shot. So we're going to adjust that formula, and then let's take another look at the impact of that on our chart. And what we see is all of the non-auto variants, including turrets, take a significant jump up on the sustained DPS axis, and rightfully so. And not only that, we can see they're all on a nice linear line, which makes sense because their burst DPS and sustained DPS is the same, which is what we would expect. And if we zoom in to try to see a bit more separation at the top, we find the Obliterator 250 MEV alpha turrets, the Exterminator 95 MEV Helion Beams, which is the non-auto variant of what we were testing against the PBO-175s earlier, and the Disruptor 3320 neutron turrets are the highest performing weapons in terms of sustained DPS in the game. So what do we make of all this? Well, based on this analysis, which weapons are the true best in the game? That's a tough question. Burst and sustained DPS are certainly important, but weapon range also plays a significant role. The non-auto variants do have slightly higher range than their auto siblings. Now for burst DPS, nothing beats missiles, but their sustained DPS is terrible because they are slow firing and it's even slower to reload. The Vanguard Hellfire autocannons have incredible DPS stats, especially for ballistic weapons, considering they don't do as much damage to an enemy's shield relative to the damage they do to its hull, but their range is a fraction of particle beams. Turrets are extremely helpful, especially on slower, heavier ships, but they often don't focus their fire on a single enemy, and continue to fire inefficiently when enemies boost away and break target lock. That said, turret weapons actually benefit twice from your tech skills. Once from their specific weapon type tech skill, and second from the automated weapon system skill, boosting their damage even more. Also, I still believe there is a strong case to be made for using auto weapons, so we can ensure full power allocation to engines and shields, and letting our weapons reload in between acquiring the next enemy ship to destroy. But the real answer here, I think it depends on what you like most. Use this spreadsheet to pick the best weapon for your style. Just make sure you correct that firing rate for those PBO-175 Auto Helion Beams.
Hey now, what was that about? Hey, look, you and I aren't exactly...
And until next time, keep building.